Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Striketh, and today we're going to take a look at the Naxx Control Paladin in its current form and talk about why it's been as successful as it has been, how to play it, and how to counter it. So, the Naxx Control Paladin right now is pretty much like I'm showing you here. Now, there are definitely variations that you can do, and there's some different spells that you can include as well as different minions in your deck to kind of vary it up a little bit. You can have a more weapon-oriented paladin, or you can have some more taunts in it, and how you actually shape your deck is completely up to you. I know a lot of people like to have secrets like Noble Sacrifice in their deck, and I think that that's perfectly fine. It just really comes down to your own personal playstyle, what works for you in the ladder. So, the Control Paladin. Why has it been so successful? Well, look at how the meta has changed since Naxx came out. Now you're seeing Hunter all of a sudden make a comeback. Hunter kind of went away and fell out of popularity, but it was never bad. It just wasn't really being played because things like Freeze Mage and such came out, and that was the flavor of the week. Everybody was playing them. So now that Hunter has kind of made a comeback, and Zoo has become even more rampant in popularity with the new cards that have come out, and even Control Warrior and Priest have also made comebacks. These all favor Paladin, especially the Handlock, which continues to get even more popular. And of course now you have the Demon Lock, so with the current state of the meta and what people have seen in recent tournaments, you're going to see even more people playing Warlock now, and a Demon Lock is going to be in the ladder. You're going to see lots of people playing demons, bigger minions, and so on. So, the Control Paladin just really kind of excels at dealing with all of these. Now, of course, card draw and RNG and such can, of course, affect your outcome in any of these matchups. You know, for example, I've definitely gotten stomped by Hunter as Control Paladin before, but that's generally because things like, I can remember in one particular game, every single card that did any sort of healing in my deck was in the bottom 11 cards, so I had no way to recover from any of the damage that had been done to me. So things like that can and will happen to you. It's called variance. Don't play one or two games with a deck and, think that, oh, if you won this one or if you lost this one, then the deck automatically sucks against that particular matchup. So that's just kind of a general advice. When you play a deck, you need to, I think, give it generally at least 20 games and kind of look at your win-loss rate from there to kind of determine how effective it really is. So, the Control Paladin is just overall really good against everything that is being played right now. Now, with new cards coming out this week and, of course, next week, that could change. It could very well be that next week Control Paladin is no longer the flavor of the week, that it's no longer really effective. But considering that most of the cards that are in this deck have been there since even before Naxx came out, and the only things that are from Naxx are the Loetheb and the Sludge Belcher, well, that's a really good sign. It means that the deck was already really solid before Naxx even came out. Now it's just even more solid. Sludge Belcher slows down a lot of your opponents, just because it's basically two taunts in one. Loetheb can completely shut down your opponents for an entire turn. Those shamans or miracle rogues or mages or whatever do not like when all of a sudden their spells all cost 5 more next turn, especially if you're up against a hunter and they can't do something like using their doggies to kill you and all of your minions. So there's a lot of great tools in this deck. Now, what makes it hard to play is the fact that this deck has a lot of different ways to deal with everything. So you might think, well, that's great. I have so many ways that I can clear the board that can keep my opponents from doing things. More so than even warriors sometimes. But this also creates a complication too, because a lot of these things are combos. Basically, a quality consecrate is that big 6 mana removal where you make all of your opponent's minions end up with 1 HP, and then you hit them with consecrate to clear the entire board. However, that is your big hard removal. If you use that and you don't have anything else in your hand and you're up against zoo or something, well then they can probably just flood the board next turn. You've probably lost tempo and board presence and such, so you're not really going to get too much out of it in a scenario like that. And again, what makes this really complicated is the fact that you do have so many options. Options are good, but say you have 8 or 9 cards in your hand. There might be 5 different ways to play that turn, but 4 of them are really incorrect in the end. So how do you determine which is the best way? And it comes from experience and knowledge and kind of predicting the future a little bit. You have to understand your opponent's deck, what you can expect them to play, and generally you have to kind of know what's going to come at you. And this could be said of any deck, but because of how many potential combinations the Control Paladin has, you can really do a lot with it. So if you blow your equality early in the game and you're up against something like a handlock, well, unless you draw into another equality later on to help deal with their giants, then you're probably going to be screwed late game, because they're going to drop these 8/8s on the board, and unless you have your humility or your elder peacekeepers, or you happen to get lucky with your other equality so you can remove them, they're just going to beat you down and kill you. So you have to be very careful. You have to bait your opponent to try and play these big minions, to play these things that you can basically neuter with the Control Paladin, so that when they do actually drop these minions on the board, they end up being completely useless. That Molten Giant is now a 1/8, and it's no real threat to anybody. You could kill your tokens with it, but that's about it. So when playing this deck, it's just really important to just try and keep your removal for when you really need it. Don't blow it too early. Remember, you have things like Holy Light in the deck, and of course Lay on Hands, and even a Guardian of Kings. I only run 1, but you can run 2 if you prefer, and these will help heal you and bring you back up to full. There's many games where I play Control Paladin, and at the end of the game, I'm at 30 life. I've just healed through everything they've done to me. The beginning of the game as Paladin is usually really slow, unless you're playing, of course, something like a Shakaden, who is more aggro oriented. You're going to take damage early on, and you're not really going to have too many responses for it usually. Generally, Elder Peacekeeper early on, or if you get a couple of Harvest Golems or something, are going to be your best bets. But outside of that, you don't really have options. So you just drop tokens and you take some damage, and your opponent thinks they're doing really well. They're like, oh, well, it's turn 4 and you're down to 22 life. Haha. But really, you are quite fine as long as every single healing card in your deck isn't on the very bottom, because you're going to be able to very easily start removing these things with True Silver Champion and Consecration and Wild Pyromancer and such. So you're going to keep control of the board from that point on, and then you're just going to heal back up to full like none of it ever happened. And that's kind of how Paladin goes. You're playing the long game. You're trying to exhaust everything that your opponent has to the point of where you can just finish them off. You don't really have burst in this deck, so that is also your weakness. If you're up against a Control Warrior and they gain a whole bunch of armor, well, you might have just lost the game. Of course, it's still very possible to win that matchup. I absolutely have in the past. But it requires playing exceptionally well and very carefully, and you're both probably going to go to fatigue. So that's kind of another reason why the Control Paladin just isn't played very often. People want quick games, especially when they're higher ranks in the ladder. They just want to get through the game as quickly as possible, get up to rank 5, rank 2, whatever, so that they can pretty much just continue the grind and get to legend. If you're playing Control Paladin, your games might take you anywhere from 15 to 25 minutes on average to finish. Now, of course, there's quicker games than that. There's definitely games where I've won in upwards of 10 minutes or so, but that's just kind of how the deck works. You need to have patience with it, and you're playing the slow game. You're not really in a rush to win. You just kind of want to make your opponent play everything they have to try and kill you, while you basically just stop them from being able to do anything at all. So how do you counter Control Paladin? Well, Aggro decks generally work really well. I've actually lost quite a few games to Zoo as well. You think, well, but you have things like Consecration and Pyromancer and Equality. Well, yes, absolutely. The problem is, Consecration costs 4 mana by itself, and there's no guarantee you're going to draw into it. Equality and Wild Pyromancer, well, that also costs 4 mana. So by the time turn 4 comes around, something like a Zulak or an aggro deck could have done a ton of damage to you, more so than you can really heal out of. There's definitely times where I've been down to anywhere between like 15 to 18 life by turn 4 from really good draws. Now, and that's assuming you actually draw into a Consecrate. If you don't draw into it, then you have no real removal. What if you don't have an Equality or a Wild Pyro either? You can use things like Elder Peacekeeper and Humility to slow them down, but the damage is still coming in. And then of course, if you remove everything they have on the board, well, if it's Zoo, they can just keep life tapping and they can just keep dumping minions on the board. So great, you've removed 4 or 5 of their minions. Now next turn they could have another up to 3 or 4 on the board to replace the ones that you just eliminated. And that is one of the biggest weaknesses. If you're playing a deck that is really fast, then they can definitely kill you before you have a time to stabilize as Paladin. The same thing goes with Hunter. If they draw really well, they get everything they need, like the Houndmaster and the Boar to just kind of charge you down, taunt up, do more damage, and just beat you in the face, then it may very well be that they're going to kill you before you have a chance to stabilize, a chance to get your Sunwalkers and your Sludge Belchers, and even maybe your Defender of Arguses up to basically halt their progress. And of course, against something like a Hunter, even if you do happen to get something on the board, they can just basically mark it and run a 1/1 into it to kill it. So it's really difficult to deal with that kind of situation, and it requires really good card draw usually, and you have to play well. You have to use your removal efficiently. If you use your removal inefficiently, then basically you're dead. It's as simple as that. So that's the biggest counter to Control Paladin. When you're playing slower decks, or even something like a Miracle Rogue, which is one of the worst matchups for a Control Paladin, where there's nothing to really do, then it's much more difficult for the Paladin to do his job. When you're up against a Miracle Rogue, they don't really have too many minions they ever put on the board, and when they do, it's to remove your own minions or just to do direct damage to your face. So more often than not, you're going to be at a disadvantage against them. They're going to draw through their entire deck, and by the time you can actually remove that one minion, well, now they've already gotten the cards they need to kill you. And you can try taunting up and healing a bit, but you know how it goes with Miracle Rogue. And I've actually found that Freeze Mage is also kind of a bad matchup. If they get the cards they need, they can completely shut down any chance that you'll ever have of doing damage to them. And of course, your taunts mean nothing. They can just completely bypass all of those with fireballs and pyroblasts and such. So you might be able to heal if you draw into the cards, but it's not going to usually be enough. And of course, some Freeze Mages are actually running Polymorph now. So you might think, oh, well, Freeze Mages are run Polymorph. I'm good to drop Tyrion. Nope. It's going to get Polymorphed, and then it's just going to get Fire Blasted down, and you're going to lose all of your momentum from that. That 5 damage with 3 durability Ashbringer that you would get from Tyrion Fordring would help tremendously with killing a mage, but if they just polymorph it, then you've lost all of that potential damage, and that could lose you the game. So, Nax Control is just basically standard Control Paladin from before Nax came out, with just a couple of additions. Just, in my case, Loatheb and Sludge Belcher, and of course I do actually like the Gnomish Inventors more than Tazdingos and such. It's a fun deck to play, but it requires a lot of thought. It's definitely one of the most complex decks in the game, and it's something you need to practice a lot with if you want to play it competitively, or even just go into higher ranks in a ladder with it. Like I said earlier, when you're playing this deck, try and keep in mind what your opponent is doing, but also what they're going to do. Use all of your removal efficiently, and make sure that when you're using your humility, that you're combining it with realistic things. Like, you don't want to use your humility on a 4/4, for example, usually, unless the situation calls for it and you absolutely have to. Generally, you want to use your humility on, let's say, a mountain giant is a great target. Use it on that, and then, of course, combine it with a stampeding Kodo to immediately remove it from the board so they can't taunt it up or buff it back up or anything of the sort. And it's just, you have to play the situations according to the cards that are in your hand and the cards that your opponent has in their hand. When you're playing something like Zoo or a aggro mage or an aggro warrior or whatever, you're not really concerned about what cards they have in their hand. You're concerned about perhaps keeping control of the board as Zoo, but as aggro, not so much. You're just basically running into their face repeatedly until they die. And if they happen to drop anything that's actually a real threat to you, then you might remove it. But this requires so much more thought than those other decks that it definitely hasn't been as popular as a result. So anyway, that is basically Control Paladin in a nutshell. If you have any questions about how to play it, let me know in the comment section below, and I'd be happy to go into details. And in the near future, I might even try to upload some actual footage of me playing the deck, so maybe you'll understand it a little bit better in that regard. Now, this deck is kind of a medium as far as dust costs. It's just over 3,000 dust to craft, maybe around 3,500, so it's not the cheapest deck by any means, but it's definitely, in my opinion, worth crafting, and it's one of those decks that I don't think is ever going to be really super ineffective. It's definitely going to be countered over time, more than likely by some of the next cards coming out even this week, but there's always going to be some variation of Control Paladin that's going to be extremely viable and extremely good. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. This is Strikeith, checking out.